at her schoolmistressing, I at my homework, my mother at her housekeeping, my father at his job as a junior executive in a company which dealt in vulcanized rubber. Our time wasn't given the slightest opportunity to grow moldy. That is why I loved to listen to Tridib. He never seemed to use his time, but his time didn't stink. Sometimes Tridib would drop in to see us without warning. My grandmother, for all her disapproval of him, would be delighted whenever he came, partly because she was fond of him in her own way, but mainly because Tridib and his family were our only rich relatives, and it flattered her to think that he had gone out of his way to come and see her. But of course, she knew, though she wouldn't admit it, that he had really come to nurse his stomach. The truth was that his digestion was a mess, ruined by rivers of hard-boiled tea he had drunk at roadside stalls all over South Calcutta. Every once in a while, a rumble in his bowels would catch him unawares on the streets, and he would have to sprint for the nearest clean lavatory. This condition was known to us as Tridib's gastric. Once every few months or so, we would answer the doorbell and find him leaning against the wall, his legs tightly crossed, the sweat starting from his forehead. But he wouldn't come in right away. There was a careful etiquette attached to these occasions. My parents and grandmother would collect at the doorway, and ignoring his writhings would proceed to ask him about his family's doings and whereabouts, and he, in turn, smiling fixedly, would ask them how they were and how I was, and finally, when it had been established to everyone's satisfaction that he had come on a family visit, he would shoot through the door straight into the lavatory. When he emerged again, he would be his usual nonchalant, collected self. He would sink into our good sofa, and the ritual of the family visit would begin. My grandmother would hurry into the kitchen and make him an omelette, a leathery little squiggle studded with green chilies, which would lie balefully on its plate, silently challenging gastric to battle. This was the greatest sign of favor she could show to a visitor. An omelette, made with her own hands. It fell to the less favored to feast on my mother's masterly tidbits. Hot shingaras, stuffed with mincemeat and raisins, or crisp little dal puris. Sometimes, watching him as he chewed upon her omelette, she would ask, "And how is gastric?" Or, "Is gastric better now?" Tridib would merely nod casually and change the subject. He didn't like to talk about his digestion. It was the only evidence of prudery I'd ever saw in him. But since I'd always heard my grandmother using that word as a proper noun, I grew up believing that gastric was the name of an organ particular to Tridib, a kind of aching tooth that grew out of his belly button. Of course, I never dared ask to see it. Despite the special omelette, however, my grandmother would not let him stay long. She believed him to be capable of exerting his influence at a distance, like a baneful planet. And since she also believed the male, as a species, to be naturally frail and wayward, she would not allow herself to take the risk of having him for long in our flat where I, or my father, might be tempted to move into his orbit. I didn't mind particularly, for Tridib was never at his best in our flat. I far preferred to run into him at the street corners in our neighborhood. It didn't happen very often, no more than once a month perhaps, but still, I took his presence on these streets so much for granted that it never occurred to me that I was lucky to have him in Calcutta at all. Tridib's father was a diplomat, an officer in the foreign service. He and Maya Devi were always away, abroad or in Delhi. After intervals of 2 or 3 years, they would sometimes spend a couple of months in Calcutta, but that was all. Of Tridib's 2 brothers, Jatin Kaku, the elder, who was 2 years older than Tridib, was an economist with the UN. He was always away too, somewhere in Africa or Southeast Asia, with his wife and his daughter, Ayla, who was my age. The third brother, Robi, who was much younger than the other 2, having been born after his mother had had several miscarriages, lived with his parents wherever they happened to be posted.